My name, of course, is Dr. Justin Bonanno. Some people I see in here are my students. Other folks, I'm an assistant professor in the communication and literature department. I just finished a book, as Dr. Hasso had suggested. It's called Walker Percy and the Crisis of Meaning. It took me about 5 years to complete the book. It was originally my doctoral dissertation, then I ended up adding chapters. And I wanted to share an excerpt or parts of the book for you tonight. So it's kind of like bits and pieces taken from the book to talk about Walker Percy, the Cunning Propagandist. A special thanks to the Department of Communication and Literature. It's just a tremendous department to be a part of, to be able to study communication in this way with eager students in a philosophical way. It's just a remarkable honor to be here. So I'm really grateful for that. And I'm really grateful for the people who helped me finish this book, because it was really painful, near the end especially. We was dragging it over the finish line. Megan Hare helped me, if you guys know who that is, Mrs. Hare. Brady Beckerman was a former student here. And my wife, of course, who is right there, spent countless hours talking about this book and Walker Percy's ideas with me in the morning. So I'm very grateful. The book is about Percy's intellectual influences, the people who informed his thinking, and it meditates especially on the relationship between symbols, meaning, and existence. So it is a theoretical book. However, it's also filled with lots of practical examples that the layperson could understand, and I wrote it in such a way that those without any familiarity with Percy could read it. So let us begin with Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Protestant theologian. He wrote, quote, "Because everyone knows the Christian truth, it has gradually become such a triviality that a primitive impression of it is acquired only with difficulty. When this is the case, the art of being able to communicate eventually becomes the art of being able to take away or trick something away from someone." When you read Kierkegaard, you're like, what is he talking about? So this is going to be the major theme of the talk for today, taking or tricking something away from someone. With Percy's work, the question is, what is he trying to trick or take away from his audiences? And arguably, it's the taken for granted image of Christianity and the gospel truth, which has been trivialized and profaned, not necessarily through malice or direct attack, but rather through a process of habitualization. Somehow the magnificent truths of the faith can get rendered commonplace. Percy wanted to make the faith, the sacraments, and the truth conspicuous, but in order to do this, he had to resort to clandestine tactics. He was an excellent rhetorician for many reasons, but above all, he had a keen sense of what his audience would tolerate, and he knew that he had to hide his artifice. This is one of Aristotle's points he makes in the Rhetoric. It's like, if you spend a lot of time in a speech, don't tell people that, okay? It should look natural. And Percy is always hiding his artifice, his art. There is a time for all things under the sun, and it is true that at times we must be direct in our speech, especially to non-believers, about God. But Percy practiced an indirect form of communication that was encouraged by the God-man himself. "Behold, I send you as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and simple as doves." So for today's talk, I want to focus on that aspect of Percy's work that I think Catholic audiences ought to know more about. And so to that end, I'm going to do 4 things. First, I'm going to give you some background on Percy, if you're not familiar with who Walker Percy is or was. And then I'll talk about what he means by this word symbol. What is a symbol? I'll outline the problem as he understands it. And in essence, spoiler alert, the problem is words and other symbols lose their signifying power. And then I'll gesture at Percy's solution, which involves tactics for indirect approaches to evangelization. So, who is Walker Percy? He was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1916, and he died in 1990. He came from an incredibly tragic background and tragic childhood. His paternal grandfather committed suicide. His father committed suicide. His mother was alleged to have committed suicide. And after the death of his parents, he went to live with his Uncle Will, who was a poet, a literary figure in the South. And while he was living with his Uncle Will, he would be brushing shoulders with literary or intellectual figures. And so that had a sort of formative influence on this sort of literary mind of Walker Percy. He was also childhood friends with Shelby Foote, who was a novelist, an excellent historian. If you've never read or listened to the audiobook like me, The Civil War by Shelby Foote, it is a wonderful book. It's very long, it's probably 75 hours, 50 to 75 hours to listen to the whole thing. But he was one of Percy's childhood friends who also sort of formed his intellect. After his parents had died and he was living with his Uncle Will, he began to come of age. And he began to place his faith in science. So he was not a Catholic. He's an adult faith to the Catholic Church, or adult convert, to the Catholic Church. He began to put his faith in science, and he began to study medicine to become a medical doctor. While he was dissecting a cadaver, he contracted tuberculosis, and he was sent to Saranac Lake in New York State to recuperate. And while he was recovering in New York State, he began to read philosophy. So he had a lot of time on his hands. And at that point in time, his mind began to change. Now, he began to read about symbols. In particular, he read the work of Suzanne Langer, who was a wonderful philosopher and thinker. Her work, Philosophy in a New Key, had a formative influence on him. And one question you might ask is, why did he study symbols? What was his sort of interest in symbols? His one daughter was deaf, and so he became very interested in making sure that she could learn at the same rate that everybody else was learning, and he started taking a real interest in symbols, in symbol use. In particular, he was very interested in the work or the life of Helen Keller, learning language. What drew Percy at last into the Catholic faith? Well, he became steadily aware of the limits of science. He had been reading Kierkegaard. He read Kierkegaard's concluding unscientific postscript, which is a Hegelian critique of idealism, and he thought to himself, I could apply the same critique to scientism. Here are people who know everything under the sun except what it means to be born, to live, and to die, which is essentially everything that matters. How to be an individual. Science cannot tell you what it means to live and to die. It cannot speak necessarily to the fullness of the human predicament. He'd read Aquinas and Augustine to debate with his friend. He's like, if I'm going to debate with this Catholic, I might as well read Aquinas and Augustine. And he eventually read Kierkegaard's essay, The Difference Between a Genius and an Apostle, while he was recovering from his tuberculosis. According to Percy, he said, if I had to single out one piece of writing which was more responsible than anything else for my becoming a Catholic, it will be that essay of Kierkegaard's, namely The Difference Between a Genius and an Apostle. It's a really important essay. It was formative because it makes a distinction between an apostle and how an apostle is different from somebody like a Shakespeare or a Plato who is a genius. And namely, the difference is a matter of authority. So the apostle comes and speaks with authority. So I mentioned Kierkegaard here. It just keeps turning up in Walker Percy's works because I want you to see how important this Danish philosopher was to him, a philosopher who also talked a lot about indirect communication. I also recorded with Dr. Dauphiné a podcast recently where we talked about this essay, so if you're interested in that, I'm not sure when it will come out, but it will come out at some point. So Percy is mostly known as a novelist. Lots of people know Percy as a novelist. He writes novels. Here he is pictured alongside Lewis Mumford. I'm not sure who the gentleman in the foreground is, but he's holding his book, The Moviegoer, which won the 1962 National Book Award. However, and this is what lots of people don't know, is that he wrote extensively about human communication and semiotics, or the study of signs and the act of signifying. If you read his Lost in the Cosmos, it's really informed by his semiotic theory. The novel was a vehicle for Percy. It was a means to an end of his apologetic work, of his defense of the faith. He wanted to imitate people like Dostoevsky, Sartre, and Camus, who put philosophical ideas into novel form. He thought that art could serve a cognitive purpose as well as a religious purpose. The novel could be a diagnostic tool, something we could use to explore the world with. And the novel and other artistic media can and should be used for moral purposes. So in a revealing letter to Caroline Gordon, he wrote, "Actually, I do not consider myself a novelist, but a moralist or a propagandist. My spiritual father is Pascal and/or Kierkegaard, and if I also kneel before the altar of Lawrence and Joyce and Flaubert, it is not because I wish to do what they do, even if I could. What I really want to do is to tell people what they must do and what they must believe if they want to live." Ultimately, due to his interest in using art, in particular the novel, for religious purposes, it's important to see him as a philosopher of communication, a rhetorician, a semiotician, in addition to a novelist. His most important work, in my mind, on the philosophy of communication is Lost in the Cosmos. In his 1984 conversation with Joe Gullidge, Percy said, "The intermezzo," which is like in the middle of the book, very middle of the book, "the intermezzo in Lost in the Cosmos, a primer on the semiotics of the self, is, despite its offhand tone, as serious as can be. I have never and will never do anything as important. If I am remembered for anything 100 years from now, it will probably be for that." So Percy's semiotic theory, characterized as it is by a type of elasticity and what Suzanne Langer would call the principle of fecundity. In other words, you can apply it to all sorts of novel contexts. When you read Lost in the Cosmos, a lot of the examples are out of date. He talks about the Phil Donahue show and Johnny Carson and all these kind of things. But you could use his ideas to understand things like 23andMe or Tony Robbins or Tinder. His ideas have a sort of generative aspect to them. They're applicable to lots of different contexts, and they help us to understand the appeal of certain contemporary cultural phenomena. So, what is a symbol? A symbol, as Percy understands it, and this is my kind of boiling down what I think Percy means by a symbol is a composite of sensuous or material media and immaterial meaning that can convey knowledge. Symbols are mundane. They're not like a flag or a brand logo. You can think of those as symbols, but when he's talking about symbols, especially in his earlier and the middle parts of his work, he's talking about that which we do all the time, namely communicate in spoken and written language. So consider the spoken word. If I repeat a word over and over again quickly, you'll begin to see the material, sensuous aspect of the symbol. So pardon me while I look dumb for a second here. Gum, 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 gum. I subject my students to this all the time. You begin to see, you hear it as the vocable that it is. It's a sound, right? But somehow, some way, this sensuous vocable, this sensuous medium becomes a vehicle for the gumness of the gum. Symbols are mundane, which is one reason why they are so often overlooked. They are that by which we know the world, but not necessarily that which we know, unless we make it an object of thought, as Percy does in his work. So I want to offer you a couple of distinctions. And these are philosophical distinctions that are carried through in Percy's work, but they really come from the American pragmatist philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. When you start looking at Percy's philosophical influences, you're like, well, there's Kierkegaard, and then there's Peirce, and then he's just drawing all over the place, and he's snatching them up and putting them to uses, arguably, that are apologetic in nature, right, to spread the Catholic faith. So the first distinction I want to give you is dyadic. Okay, dyadic events. What is a dyadic event? From the word dyad, which means two things in relation, two entities in relation. In this case, entity A and entity B. This is one way of understanding what happens in the world. In Aristotle's sort of metaphysics, his way of making sense of what makes a thing, this would be the efficient cause, or in Latin, the vis a tergo, the force from behind that causes the thing to be the thing. Okay, so if I'm playing pool and I strike the pool ball, I strike it and then it hits the other pool balls. So event A, me striking it, causes event B, it rolling down the table and hitting the other balls. If I drink some caffeine, my blood pressure might go up. Okay, so the caffeine is the stimulus, and the blood pressure going up is the response. Dyadic events are real. They're happening all around us all the time. When Pavlov tinkles his bell and the dog begins to salivate, that is a dyadic event. All right? Now, people think of the brain in dyadic terms when they consider how the brain causes mental states. And it's true. The brain can operate in a dyadic manner. Phineas Gage is the famous example. Is a guy who got a railroad tie driven through his prefrontal cortex, or the front half of his brain, and he began to behave differently because of that event, right? Event A causes changes in event B. But the strict materialist, the strict determinist must think of himself, his mind, simply as a cause of the brain. Right? He's just along for the ride because his brain is causing his thoughts, his actions, and so on. Now, another application of dyadic events in our culture is how we consider knowledge, how we get knowledge. We think of knowledge as a dyadic event, or we can, right? We're invited to be objective. So we're invited to allow event A, which is an object, to impress itself on our senses. And the ideal is to be objective, correct? So here again, here's your dyadic event, A causing B, and then the object will impress itself on our senses and we'll know it. But we have to be passive in order to be objective. But the question is this how we really know the world? Do we really know the world in this manner? And I would say no. Because, in particular, we're not angels. We don't know the world directly. We know the world instead through symbols. And they stand between us and the world around us. They allow us to access being, to access existence. Which leads us on to the next distinction, which is the triadic event. So triad from three entities in relation. So pardon me real quick. I'm going to take a sip of water. The exemplary case of a triadic event is Helen Keller learning a word for the first time. And as the story goes, she's out by the water pump, and the spigot is pouring water over her one hand, and her teacher, Anne Sullivan, is spelling out into her other hand, W-A-T-E-R, over and over and over again, until she has the realization that this thing over here is this thing over here. There is a real relationship, a real identity between this thing and this thing. And so she has a breakthrough into language. Okay, it's a sort of ontological breakthrough. She can say what water is. That's what it is. It's a different orientation towards the world as opposed to sort of mere stimulus response or biological adaptation. And it's transcendent at first. When you watch a child learn language, right? And when you read picture books with kids, they're always asking, what is it? What is it? Before they graduate to why, which they'll ask you 1,000,000 times. But it's the symbol, the sensuous symbol, that allows the triadic event to play out and to happen. And this particular relationship is characterized by a type of simultaneity in time. You can't actually reduce each side of the triangle to one of these dyadic events, right, causing them. It's a sort of all at once, this is that. Which leads to the next distinction, which is a tetradic event. Okay, this doesn't actually, I'm not sure if this actually appears in Pers, but it definitely appears in Percy. And tetrad from 4, right? Simple, 2, 3, 4. 4 entities in relation. The other person is on the other side of that naming event. So it's Anne Sullivan naming for Helen. And when we learn in community. We are communal beings. We are the zoon logikon, the zoon politikon, the animal with logos, the animal that is part of a community, the polis. And so we learn our language and we get our symbols from others. We name with and for others. Oftentimes we pick up things and we just say them and we don't really even realize where they come from. And then we're talking to someone and they're talking just like us. And we pick up these sort of linguistic habits and words from people around us. The word consciousness is revelatory because the word consciousness etymologically comes from con plus scire, which is to know with. In other words, we know the world with others. Consciousness is intersubjective. It doesn't begin in this sort of solipsistic Cartesian, here I am in my individual ego, and then we find others. We find others first, and then, it's kind of a degeneration when we fall into ourselves. This is a point that Percy wants to make. So, in essence, I know the distinctions, okay? So, simple. Dyadic, triadic, tetradic. Essentially, what is important is that we don't know existence directly, but mediately, through the very thing that the world is made of. Humans know through sensuous media, the sensuous symbol, the sound, the gesture, the icon. We know existence through existence. Thus, we know the world through symbols. But here's the catch. Symbols can also lead to ignorance. And hence, we have the problem. So what is the problem? The symbol can yield joy and revelatory insight, but over time, boredom can set in, familiarity can set in. And so consider how words can be devalued at the individual level. We'll talk about that actually in just a second. I want to introduce another term for you. A simulacrum is what a symbol eventually degenerates into when it ceases to signify. It hardens into a simulacrum, which is essentially like a clot of the mind, a clot of our understanding. It's a mummified symbol, a cliche, a semantic husk, the corpse of the symbol that once revealed existence, that which induces ignorance. The term that Gabriel Marcel, who Walker Percy draws on, Catholic philosopher, calls it a locum tenens, or a holding place for being. It's a shell of reality. It's at one remove from reality. So, I want to give you another example. When a child first learns what this is, it's a sparrow. Father or mother goes, "What is it?" The child's asking, "What is it?" "It's a sparrow, that's what it is." And much like Helen learning water, it's a sparrow, that's what it is. And maybe the child walks around and points out the sparrow. As the child grows up, sees lots of sparrows outside the house. Yeah, it's just a sparrow. That's all it is. It's just a sparrow. It's only a sparrow. And it becomes taken for granted. That thing becomes a mere boring simulacrum that no longer inspires wonder. And the child may simply cease to pay attention to it, to wonder at it. So, thus a simulacrum. Now, that's at the individual level, right? Things get boring, become commonplace, become devalued. But words and other symbols get devalued at the collective level as well. And so what are some words that are rendered commonplace? Love, truth, beauty, brotherhood of man, life, and so on. Importantly for Percy, words such as God, grace, sin, redemption, salvation, and even religion itself have been devalued. If you mention the word religious film to someone, depending on who they are, their eyes may simply just glaze over. They won't watch it because they know it's a religious film. In his essay, Novel Writing in an Apocalyptic Time, I love this, Percy writes, "In the best movie of last year, a disturbed young man played by Timothy Hutton consults a psychiatrist a couple of times. Breaks down, hugs the psychiatrist, says, 'I love you,' and is cured. He also has a communication problem with his father. They both break down, hug, cry, say, 'I love you.' All is well. Lines of communication are opened. Love is the answer." Who is going to protect words like love, guard against their devaluation? One hopeful sign about the movie was that God was not mentioned. He continues. He says, "In times such as these, a time of pollution and corruption of meaning, it is no wonder that the posture the novelist often finds natural is that of derision, mockery, subversion, and assault. To mock and subvert the words and symbols of the day in order that new words come into being or that old words be freshly minted, to assault the benumbed sensibility of the poor media consumer, because anything other than assault and satire can only be understood as a confirmation of the current corrupted meanings of such honorable old words as love, truth, beauty, brotherhood of man, life, and so on. There may be times when the greatest service a novelist can do his fellow man is to follow General Patton's injunction, attack, 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 attack the fake in the name of the real." The religious artist has the job of reanimating religious symbols. Percy writes, "One of the tasks of the saint is to renew language, to sing a new song." Psalm 91 reads, "Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth." Percy believes that the psalmist provides insight into the importance of coining new words. Given the devaluation of religious language in the postmodern era, Percy asks, how does the Christian novelist set about writing? Having cast his lot with a discredited Christendom and having inherited a defunct vocabulary. Elsewhere, he replies to his own question, the novelist must use every ounce of skill, cunning, humor, even irony to deliver religion from the merely edifying. In our world, there is an indifference at play, more subversive than hostility. And the question is how to unsettle this indifference. And so we move into the solution, or at least a solution as Percy understands it. And that solution is to defamiliarize. The goal must be to make the familiar unfamiliar. Literally, you must defamiliarize the taken for granted. So, as a verb here, to make something strange, to render the inconspicuous conspicuous. The way that you bust up the hardened over simulacrum. Now, the thinker that Percy drew on for this aspect of his work was the Russian literary critic Viktor Shklovsky, who discussed defamiliarization. He was Russian. He used the term ostranenie, or the sort of estrangement device. It's translated into English variously, but one of them is defamiliarization. He talks about it as the device for making strange. So over time, in our experience, right, perception becomes automatic. We see the bird as just a sparrow. Think about learning a new language for the first time. You might not remember when you were a child, but if you've ever tried to pick up a new language, how difficult it is to go through the forms, to learn how to conjugate verbs, to use this word in this context but not another. But over time, it becomes taken for granted. It falls away from your awareness. The same thing with using any given technology, of which writing is foremost. You have to learn it first, and it's painful and it's difficult, but it becomes taken for granted. Now, it's kind of nice to not have to think about how I need to bend my legs and my back at the same time when I sit down in a chair. Habitualization, the automatic sort of process of our perception, the taken for grantedness of things is kind of nice sometimes. Whenever we become habituated to something, however, we begin to take it for granted. And so Shklovsky writes, the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception. In other words, art delays and disrupts the automatic recognition of familiar objects or events. For Shklovsky, the point of art is to make the stone stony again, to return the stoniness to the stone. So herein we reach a point where we can talk about Percy finally as a cunning propagandist who wants to make the truths of the faith strange. He wants to make them weird. In many, if not all of his novels, Percy defamiliarizes the sacraments. If you read carefully, it's marriage in Love in the Ruins, it's confession in Lancelot, and so on. For the purposes of this presentation, I want to focus on the tactics of defamiliarization that Percy uses, at least some of them, in Lost in the Cosmos. And I want to do this for two reasons. First, I read Lost in the Cosmos around the time of my conversion to Catholicism. And as I was reading it, he wasn't coming at me. He wasn't preaching at me. But I was recognizing that he was saying something that was true. He was putting his finger on something. He was articulating something that I had felt or thought, but it hadn't taken form. The second reason why I want to talk about this particular book is most people know Percy as a novelist. So I wanted to unsettle that label a bit so that people can appreciate him as something else in addition to that, namely as a philosopher of communication. So you can think of these tactics that he uses as commonplaces for rhetorical and poetic invention. So Lost in the Cosmos, I love this book. I've sent it to a number of people. I'm not sure how many people actually have read the book that I've sent them, but I keep sending it to people. It's the one of the books for me that really bears repetition, and I could keep reading. It was the book that eventually got me interested in going to grad school. I looked up semiotics, Pittsburgh. I was living in Pittsburgh, and then I ended up at a grad program to study rhetoric and the philosophy of communication. So, in Lost in the Cosmos, Percy wants to defamiliarize the self. Okay, we live in a culture, a century of the self. What is the self? Heidegger does this, by the way, who informed Percy, by using a different term for the self. He just uses a totally different word. He calls it Dasein, or the being that is there. And so Percy is influenced by Heidegger, by Marcel, by Kierkegaard, by Peirce. You get the point. He's drawing from lots of different sources. Anyway, his question is, do you know who you are? This work is a satire of self-help books. I love the subtitle. It's just the last self-help book. You won't need any more after you read Lost in the Cosmos. And his opponents are those who have made self-help cliche. And so the book uses an epic amount of questioning. He's constantly asking questions, and he's providing mock answers. So he asks, for example, here's one of his questions. This is a paraphrase. Why are there 16 schools of psychotherapy and 16 schools of personality, but only one generally accepted theory of the cause and cure of pneumococcal pneumonia? It's an interesting question. He writes, why is it that when you are shown a group photograph in which you are present, you always, and probably covertly, seek yourself out to see what you look like? Don't you know what you look like? See, he's saying things that are true, and you're going, hey. The book concludes with a recorded transmission from an alien. And the transmission is just, do you have a self? Do you know who you are? Do you know what you're doing? Do you love? Do you know how to love? Are you loved? Do you hate? Do you read me? Come back. Repeat. Come back. Come back. Come back. So he uses questioning to sort of unsettle and defamiliarize things for his audiences. The other thing he does is he plays with form. Different types of forms. It's hard to characterize this book. Is it a novel? Is it a nonfiction work? What is it? It's filled with quizzes, short vignettes, and a philosophical essay on semiotics right in the middle. The book anticipates in many ways a type of Substack or like a blog where people are just throwing different things in there, mixed media. It's very postmodern in that regard. Postmodern in a good sense. Sometimes postmodernism is weird, but in a good way, he's drawing on different forms. Decontextualization and travel. What he does is he puts the familiar in unfamiliar situations, or the unfamiliar in a familiar situation. He moves it to a different context. So he uses time travel to do this. In the example from the book on the Phil Donahue show, which is kind of like the Dr. Phil of our day, he has John Calvin, a Confederate soldier, and an alien on as guests. It's remarkable, the possibilities that play out from this time travel. But he also uses space travel. The book has 2 space odysseys in it. It's excellent. A shift in perspective. He actually, Shklovsky talks about this, and Shklovsky includes an example from Leo Tolstoy in his short story, Kolstomer, where he has a horse reflect on the nature of private property. What would it be like for a horse to reflect on being owned by another person? But Percy uses this in Lost in the Cosmos. He uses an alien to talk to people. And he writes, only a Martian can see man as he is, because man is too close to himself and his vision too fragmented. So in this book, he literally takes a Martian view. He has a human being talk to aliens. And the Martian view helps to clear away these simulacra that prevent Percy's object of study, which is the human being, from appearing. At one point, he says, there's only really one alien in the cosmos. It's you. It's kind of unsettling. Using unfamiliar names to refer to simulacra. So, in the book, he talks about the Christian, quote unquote, which is arguably a simulacrum, as C3 consciousness. If you read this book and you need like a key to kind of unpack it, when he's talking about C3 consciousness, he's just talking about Christians, people who realized that they're in trouble and sought help. C2 consciousness, that's his term or his name for a sinner, somebody who has fallen into the pit of themselves, who has become curved in on themselves, and who tries all manner except the one way they should be trying to get out of it. And so he withholds the typical name for the thing and instead gives another. And then finally, the post-apocalyptic. Percy thought that the novelist could make vicarious use of ordeal or trial to defamiliarize reality. An apocalypse is a revelation, apocalypsis, literally a peeling back of the veil to reveal the truth. It's a type of taking away of the simulacrum. In essence, the post-apocalyptic makes the mundane appear charged with significance again. I was talking about this with Dr. Delphine the other day. When the end of the world is upon us, it's not just a battery. It's not just a flashlight. It's not just a water bottle. You know what that water bottle is going to mean for you at the end of the world? It's going to serve a multitude of purposes, right? And so the prepper transcends the boredom of the ordinary by planning for the end of the world. In fact, the prepper is already living in the end of the world, charging the mundaneness of reality with significance. I want to talk just about a couple other people. So this is, again, not an exclusive list of tactics he uses in Lost in the Cosmos. Just talk about a couple other people here as I work to conclude, who I think also do a good job packaging the faith, the truths of the faith, into symbols that really resonate, into symbols that really signify. Of course, Flannery O'Connor, she had read Percy's work. He had read her work. If you've ever read The Violent Bear It Away, there's a particular simulacrum that she's after in that book, which is baptism. I won't say anything else beyond that. C.S. Lewis uses a shift in perspective. He uses aliens in his Ransom trilogy, if you've ever read that. And if you've ever read his Four Loves, he uses translation, translating that term love, which has become a simulacrum, into eros, agape, storge, and philia, to help you see the phenomenon again. In terms of more contemporary examples, sorry that's a little dark, consider A Hidden Life. I'm not sure if you all have seen A Hidden Life. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. It's directed by Terrence Malick. I'm not sure what his intentions were. I'm not sure if he was Catholic. But he gives us the life of a saint. He paints a picture of a true Christ, a man who suffered for what he believed. But he never announces his work as propaganda. He never preaches. He is never overt. He merely shows us a true sacrifice, an imitation of Christ. And it is truly inspiring. Consider the work of the graphic artist Daniel Mitsui. Mitsui retrieves a medieval form of composition, as in the case of Our Lady Endure of Knots here. And in other works, he draws upon different contexts. For example, Japanese imagery to convey religious themes, to help them signify again, as in the case here of St. Michael slaying the dragon. What do these different artifacts have in common? They're all well made. It's not enough that they're religious. They have to be well made. We cannot forget the importance of skill in composition and artistry in moving others towards the perception of the truth. As Percy writes, art is a virtue of the practical intellect. It is in the sphere of making, not reasoning, not reporting. A good novel is like a good table. The parts have to fit. It has to work. That is, sit foursquare and at the right level. And it has to please. Its truth lies in the way it looks, feels, hefts, the touch and the grain of the thing. Its morality follows from the form and the excellence of the thing. That is to say, its morality comes from within, follows naturally from its making, and is not imposed from without. It does not preach. So, I want to give you a couple parting thoughts. Today, I've given you an introduction to Percy's work and some of, three key terms: symbol, simulacrum, and defamiliarization. The problem that we face as Christians is not so much hostility as indifference. How do you get other people to pay attention? You have to be cunning and indirect. The symbols of our faith have been devalued into simulacra that merit defamiliarization. If you're interested in learning more about Percy, I've got a little sign-up sheet here. If you want to put your name and your email on the list. My book, Walker Percy and the Crisis of Meaning, is currently available in the library. I'm working on a solution to get the book cheaper for students and faculty here on campus. So if you signed up, I'd be able to keep you in the loop in that regard. So let us return to the quote that opened this presentation. Because everyone knows the Christian truth, it has gradually become such a triviality that a primitive impression of it is acquired only with difficulty. When this is the case, the art of being able to communicate eventually becomes the art of being able to take away or trick something away from someone. So, what must we trick away from others? We must take away their taken for granted simulacra, especially those that pertain to the Catholic faith, and we have to be cunning in the process, as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves, as aspiring musicians, novelists, filmmakers, or philosophers. We could do worse than imitate that exemplar of cunning propagandists, Walker Percy. Thanks.